cool video, right? Like Matt sent me this, so.
Oh, okay, so Matt sent you that?
Yep. So, I'll back this up a little bit so that way.
Is it one that the church has? Or
This just
is
up
it
on
just,
YouTube.
yeah, that's what I was wondering if it was a YouTube. Okay, cool.
So, if I can get this mostly focused. So, I wanted to kind of, do this because we're going to take a little different tact on kind of how we study First John with this. We're not kind of going to do verse by verse, and part of that is because of this, right? Like I love his diagram over here. You can see that. He talked about how he's really talking about life, love, truth, and I think the other one is faith in this, but he kind of covers it in a ton of different little ways that all together kind of bring together these ideas, but really they're kind of all over the place. So, this week we're going to cover mostly chapter 1, but there's some stuff that we're going to pull out of other chapters. And in other chapters we'll cover like half of one chapter and half of another. So, with this, just to kind of go a little more in depth on kind of the historical side of things, the heresy that they're talking about with this is actually called Gnosticism, which is kind of this idea that, what the physical world doesn't really matter at all in the big scheme of things. And it's all about kind of having this elevated spiritual experience, kind of a super hype, super emotional type thing. And, there are others in that time that are saying as well, you can't get to heaven unless you know the secret password. They're all about kind of secret knowledge, and you have to know that. And you can't know that unless you pay the right people or you know the right people. So he's talking into this time where all of this kind of stuff is happening. And, really, the Judaizers that Paul deals with so much, these people are still kind of around, but they're not as big at this point, because the church is kind of split from Judaism at that point. It's kind of now its own separate thing. They've been kicked out of the synagogues and stuff like that. And this is also written into kind of roughly maybe 60 AD to like 80, 90 AD. They're not quite sure. Part of it is we don't have anybody that says, hey, this is John writing this like Paul does. I'm writing this from such and such place. Well, between 60 and 90 AD, the temple is destroyed. Jerusalem gets sacked with this. And you have some of the worst persecution in church history ever, basically. They're dragging people out of houses, they're crucifying lots of people. Lots of people are getting thrown into the Colosseums, for gladiator fights and being killed by lions and things like that. So it's kind of what he's writing all of this into. And it's interesting because he doesn't mention anybody by name. He doesn't mention this is who's writing it. He just says, he uses language like my children. So he's kind of writing this, both that allows it to just kind of be shared out. This is kind of a letter for all of the churches in the region that way. But it also protects anybody from being picked up by the cops, basically. They don't have any names in here, so it's not like you can say, oh yeah, it's that person. Or at least everybody named John needs to show up and we're going to search everybody's houses. You don't have that, right? But it's kind of a big deal in this. And so for me, oh, we had it plugged in.
Oh, bottom plug. Top plug doesn't work.
Oh. There we go. Too funny. But so for me, really, this kind of gives the letter a tone of, this is kind of John. He's older at this point. He's later in life. He's kind of seen all these churches grow, and now it's like, hey, life's getting serious. You're hitting all these persecutions. We're dealing with all these conflicts. Life is getting serious. And so when John talks about, this light and darkness, we went through the sermon series a couple of weeks ago, on that. But he's really saying, if you're not gonna live right, then you're gonna be falling into this darkness. And so he's really kind of impressing on people that, look, God's light and love are the way that we need to go, and kind of this is what we're up against. It's kind of how he's setting this up. And so he's going to be, kind of like he said, he's going to use a lot of hyperbole. There's going to be a lot of really definite, strong, hard statements that say, this is the way you got to do things. And so it's almost, for me, I kind of get this image of, this is the general setting up, the army is under attack, and he's trying to get everybody back in and kind of refocused on the plan, on what they need to do to win this battle, is really how this comes across to me. And so that's why we're kind of taking this as, what are these battles that we fight in our everyday lives? What do we deal with that way? If that makes sense. Like it's kind of how I see it that way. So
when I ask a question, if we need to go,
yeah.
how, I mean, this is the same John that wrote John, right? So why did he write this after he had already written John? Are they totally two different purposes?
Well, yeah. You kind of think about it. The Gospel of John is like, hey, this is the record of stuff. Like, this is what we saw. So First John starts off, that which from the beginning, which we have heard, we have seen with our own eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared, and we have seen it and testify to it, and we will proclaim it to you, the eternal life, which was with the Father and has appeared to us. We proclaim to you that what we have seen and heard, so that you might also have fellowship with us. And our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. So that's kind of how he starts off. But you think about it, like that's the Gospel of John is, hey, this is him setting everything down. This is kind of the basics that way. Well, First John is that reminder, like, okay, I know you guys have read John, so guess what? Here's kind of the follow-up course, basically, or, this is what you got to keep doing, So that's kind of how he positions it. At least that's kind of how I think about it. So, because a lot of it, he starts off, hey, that God is light and the world is darkness, and this is kind of where we sit that way. If that makes a little more sense. So, any other kind of questions, either about the video or the intro that way, just before we get rolling? Cool. So with this, and this is where I'm hoping this comes off right. Because we're kind of going to do a little bit of a kind of a attack. We're going to look at kind of the rest of chapter 1 and kind of what John is saying, and then we're going to look at kind of how that gets involved in our daily lives. So, somebody want to read, let's say like 5 through 7, chapter 1?
I'll give it a shot. This is the message. This is the message which we have heard from him and declare to you that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. If we say that we have fellowship with him and walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus Christ his Son cleanses us from all sin.
Yeah, so really with this, this is where kind of the battle starts taking shape for me. John is saying, God is light and the world is darkness. So how do we feel that in our daily lives? That's kind of what I started to think about. You start seeing this, and for me, I see it in every day at work. I got all these stressed out people, these freaked out people that, they don't really know what's going on, and, they don't have a good basis on which to live their lives. They don't know God, and so they react their way, and I'm tempted to react that way. Or that's kind of the darkness side of things, or I could walk in the light and I could try to help them and I could pray for them and I can do those things. So that's kind of how it sets up in my life. I could just saw it was like, oh yeah, that's right, duh, like this is this is what he's talking about. There's the light, there's the darkness. You know, so it's kind of that war of temptation, you know, kind of Paul talks about it as the old self and the new self. You know, but there's this conflict here. And the one thing, you know, I first wanted to kind of point out before we get into this is that it's not a conflict like a battle of two armies, you know, where one side or the other could win. It all just depends on who's got the better gear or is more organized, that kind of stuff. It's not that type of battle. Like, this is the type of battle where, you know, it's kind of like when light meets darkness. I was kind of thinking about the sunrise, you know, as it comes up, you know, that sun is just going to light everything up. You know, as soon as that hits, you know, at kind of its peak, right, there's almost no shadow. And that's kind of how I look at this, is really it's not like a back and forth fight. You know, it's that God's winning. You know, God is the light. God is just winning. And eventually all of the darkness will just be, you know, cast out and, you know, put in prison that way. If that makes sense.
Keep going.
No problem. So it's, when we look at this, you know, really the only power that the darkness has in our lives is situational or in temptation that way. You know, that's really the only power it has, the power to kind of to tweak us and to poke at us and to say, okay, you know, is that really true? Or, you know, it'd be way easier to act like this, you know, you lie at work or something. You know, hey, it's just easier to lie than actually tell people this stuff's going wrong.
Okay, the next verse. If we say we have no sin, we are a liar.
Yep.
So no matter what, I mean, we strive to be perfect, but
What's that? Yeah.
we're gonna screw up.
We're gonna screw up, you know, and you know, yeah, that's verse 8 there, you know, and then John says, you know, it's not about living perfect. That's kind of not what he's talking about. You know, in verse 9, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. You know, so he puts that in there, and, you know, the first verse in chapter 2, this is kind of where we're going to jump around a little bit. So, you know, he says, I write to you that you will not sin. He starts out chapter 2, but if anybody does sin, we have one who speaks to the Father on our defense. You know, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. You know, so he's setting this up. He's like, look, you're in a battle, and really you need to be doing these things. You know, the light basically is following Jesus' commands, you know, and living the way he would have us live. And he says, look, I know you're not going to do it. Nobody's perfect, so we are covered. So he's not talking about salvation here, but he's talking about it's very important the way that we live that way. So he's kind of setting this up. And so, yeah.
This is something I've been struggling with lately, because it's kind of like, right now I seem to be getting beaten up inside in the sense that, hey, you're no good. And it's kind of like, maybe I'm walking in light 75% of the time.
Yep.
You know, and here it says, if we say that we walk in darkness, well, 25%, maybe even more, I don't know, is darkness. It's
Darkness is still darkness, you know? Yeah. Well, and that's where I got back to, you know, it mentions up here that, you know, John is being very, very strong about this, and he's using very strong language, because there's a whole lot of people at the time that are saying, it doesn't matter. You know, Jesus wasn't really God. You know, God will just take us all to heaven, you know, or it's about having this secret knowledge, you know, out of all of these extra things that are kind of really split in the church. You know, and so what's that in our daily lives? You know, what distracts us in our daily lives? What do we hit that, you know, as the one verse says, you know, what sin drags us away and you know, tempts us that way? Or what situations do we hit that we see this in? Anybody got any ideas?
Oh.
Well, if you don't want to share it, you know, so
Well, I mean,
mine, right? Let's see, let's make sure this is the right way. Okay. So like mine, right, you know, it's work. And for me at work, it's dealing with these situations. So, you know, really, I kind of thought about, you know, it comes down to fear. right? I want to do things right. I want to help people at work. I want to do stuff, but I don't really like conflict. You know, I get into it all the time just because that's what, you know, kind of the personality I have, but I don't like conflict. So, you know, I'm afraid about that. I worry. I have that, you know, that anxiety. I spelled that wrong.
It's X.
Had all the right stuff in the wrong order. So, you know, that's one option. Or kind of like with my brothers, right? You know, anybody that says things, it's this dragging up of old stuff. You get into something and, you know, all of a sudden you're not really fighting about what just happened. You're fighting about all the old stuff that you're holding on to. So, conflict that way. So, I wasn't quite sure how to put that, but.
Well, I've been talking a lot, sorry. One of mine is superheroes. I collect superheroes. I get carried away. Really, superhero figures.
Yeah.
You know, am I making that an idol? Not on purpose. Sometimes maybe. You know, I got to be aware of it.
Well, there's both a lot of great things that we see in superheroes, but anything, you know, could be an idol. You know, let's say TV, let's say sports. You know, I once joked that I was going to write a giant paper on how football was the first major religion in the U.S. You know, you think about it, right? They show up, they worship in giant stadiums and all cheer and everything like that. You pay a ton of money for food and gear and all that kind of stuff. You know, so you look at that, right? But anything, you know, our job can become an idol. You know, money is kind of the big one. You know, people get stuff just because it says, hey, I have a lot of money. You know, success. You know,
Time. How we spend it, use it, look at it.
so, you know, and that's a tiny little bit, but, you know, also at work, you know, lying. In my job, it's really easy. You know, I have to do reports all the time. Well, this is what we actually did, and this is how much we made for your business with your marketing and stuff like that. It's really easy to just swap a few numbers so they look better. You know, I know people do that. But, so this is, you know, a short list of all this stuff, but in John's day, you know, there's also the sexual stuff. You know, people going out, well, Jesus took care of everything, right? So we can just do whatever we want. You know, there's pride. Well, my time for me, God, is more important than my time for you. You know, I'm really important, and making sure that everybody knows I'm really important. You know, we see stuff like that. So, anything else that we're looking at? Or because part of this, in this series, we're going to do kind of 6 weeks, and these weeks are going to be the tools that we can use to kind of deal with some of these things in our everyday life.
I don't know, this is kind of the inverse of things, but it's kind of like, sometimes I struggle with anxiety and things like that. And sometimes I get into this habit of just keeping so busy that it's, I don't know what you call it, busyness.
Yeah.
It keeps my mind preoccupied, and that in and of itself is probably not good.
Because I cannot remember how to spell for the life of me. But yeah, you know, kind of that saying, this is the stuff I'm going to do. I mean, I do that. You know, I you know, trust me, I've been working on this stuff basically since we quit doing the other class, and trying to always like, okay, I know we're going to do this. I'm going to try and do this, and like, yeah.
I'm
I'm
too busy to pray. I'm too busy to worship. Sometimes you heard this expression, I pray so I don't have to do something that Christ wants me to do. Yeah.
I don't think I've heard that one, no.
No, really, it's.
But I
Well,
believe ya.
You know, yeah, there are some people like, well, I'm doing all these other things, so, you know, I can't show up to the mission trip or the work day when it's like, you know.
Yeah, sometimes you know God like within yourself, he wants you to do something. It's, oh, I'm gonna do some other Christian thing, but not this thing. I could do that a lot.
So kind of, not doing what God wants us. Something like, okay, God laid this on your heart. You really should do this, whether it's like helping out with the youth or kids or something like that. Well, that's uncomfortable, God. So could I do this instead? Could I do prayer group instead? Or could I teach a class instead? Does that count? Does that check my box on, what's kind of the way I think about it? It's like I've got this righteousness box. So it's like, yeah, does that fill it? Is that? And it's like, no, because the only person that filled that is Jesus. So really with this is kind of, it might be a tough class in some ways because it's gonna, it's asking us, what are we doing, or what could we do differently that we're not, what are we dealing with this way? And so, because part of this, like John is giving us kind of these, hey, act the way you should. He says, I'm not writing you anything new. It's kind of how he starts out. He was like, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I'm telling you to live it out. And Matt said, weeks ago, it was like, if I could only live like a quarter of what I knew about the Bible, I'd be a way better Christian. And that kind of stuck with me. I was like, shoot, that's absolutely right. I was kind of been thinking about that. Like, what if I could just live this, right? And it's, that kind of crystallized it the way he said it. And if I could live the Sermon on the Mount, if I could just live and love the people that are around me,
You be getting jealous of other Christians that are doing these incredible things and you're not?
Well, it's not about getting jealous, but just like kind of that rubber meets the road type theology. It's like, okay, I've learned about all this stuff. Am I actually putting it into action? Is it making a difference in my life? That's kind of what John's getting at. And so,
well, isn't he also talking to this other group that has fallen away? So it sounds like there's this struggle of what is right, what is the truth. So it's not that they're just not living right. They're all of a sudden now being deceived in what they truly have experienced and believed.
yeah, that's kind of the way that John writes this. It makes me think he's kind of writing to everybody that's left. He's not necessarily specifically addressing those people that have decided to go this way. He's kind of addressing the people that have stayed true. Kind of, in some aspect, he's, kind of hoping that they're going to kind of, pray for these people, help these people come back. But, so that, there's a little bit of a different dynamic there that way. So, I mean, certainly if anybody of those got a hold of this was like, okay, yeah, I'm not doing this right. I need to get back to kind of basics, really, is kind of how I think about it. But in a lot of the times, these groups were also just saying, well, the apostles and those guys don't have it right, so don't listen to them. That was kind of one of their big pushes that way. So, when Paul writes, hey, I'm Paul, this is kind of my story, it's kind of a little bit of a defense against that. Or John, like how he starts out, I'm writing to you about what we saw and what we touched because we walked with this guy. So it's kind of a little bit of a defense against that. So he's saying, yeah, and he's going to get into it. We're going to, I don't know if it's next week or the week after, but we're going to talk about kind of the antichrists, the deceivers, as the video talked, that they were dealing with, and kind of where we see that in our daily life too.
Okay.
So it's one of those things. But and so really, I forget, how long does service go? Does it go till 12? I think it goes
He
till
was
12.
running a little off too, so I can't remember.
Yeah, I forget. But
It was pretty true to time.
that's what I was just thinking. I couldn't
Yeah,
remember.
officially, it's supposed to be 12, but a lot of times it's 12, 15, but
Yeah.
that's what I've experienced.
So,
It's kind of cool. Was it the last verse in the chapter? If we say that we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us.
mm-hmm.
So it's this ideal of faith. You know, confess.
Yeah, it's like
Confess that stuff.
confess it, be honest about it. And so, part of this, this week I called this the battle of intel, right? Because, battle of intelligence, right? Military intelligence is this idea, okay, do you know where the enemy is? Because in battle, you're either going to meet head on, you're going to have a battlefield set, you're going to meet head on, kind of like what they used to in World War II, or you're going to have this kind of ambush fighting, which is a lot of what they're seeing in the Middle East, for the last couple of years and right now. It's this, okay, you're getting ambushed by the enemy that way. And so what I was thinking was, all of these things in our daily lives, do we know where we're getting hit? Do we know where we're going to get ambushed? Is kind of my idea with this. We know, okay, well, I struggle with this, and, afterwards I feel bad, I confess, I pray, but let's get ahead of that. In kind of John says it, it's chapter 2, verse 1, "My dear children, I write this to you so that you will not sin." So you don't have to sin. And that's kind of where I want to kind of focus this course is, okay, so this is the result of kind of losing an individual battle in our lives, is kind of all of these little sins that we hit. So do we know how to get ahead of this and make sure we're prepared in advance? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. It's kind of that, so for me, right, because I'm never going to ask anybody to do something that I'm not willing to do myself, I know that when I struggle, because I struggle with, fear all the time, anxiety all the time, I don't really understand that whole peace thing that, God tells us about. It's like, okay, look, we have all these great verses that talk about, I am your shepherd, I am your tower, I am the Lord who is with you always, to the ends of the earth. And it's like, okay, so why can't I live that out? So for me, it was like, first I had to look at it and I had to say, okay, where are the situations that I feel that fear in? So I kind of went through, it was like, okay, so what are my situations, right? And we're going to call this the situation for the rest of the class, have some cool slang terms for things, but so my situation was work stuff, right? Meetings, or dealing with my boss, because she's pregnant and she does some crazy things now that I really don't understand. And so I look at that and I say, okay, what do I need to do to set myself up for success? I didn't want to kind of talk about this as like, hey, we win everything. It's not winning our daily walk. It's fighting our daily walk. Because winning for us in this is kind of figuring out this situation. It's like, okay, so when I know, so kind of working back from this, so let's say, sin is the result, right? So what can I do before I get to work is kind of my thought. Now it's like, okay, if I know I'm going to hit this at work, what do I do? And so for me, there's prayer, right? Because every good set of tools that any Christian teaches has to involve prayer, right? But there's also some preparation. I don't know, it's getting kind of small, so if you guys want, you can snap a picture afterwards. But, with this, it's going in, and this is why I was kind of thinking, okay, we'll call this the battle of intel. Because if I know where I'm going to get ambushed, I get ambushed at work. So how do I prepare to make sure that when I get ambushed, I can fight back? Because a lot of the times, and for me, I just react. I don't think about God. I don't think about my devotional, right? Like how many people remember their devotional by noon or, at the end of the day when they actually get into a situation where, oh yeah, that'd be great and super helpful, but, so it's like, okay, so this is where I'm going to get ambushed. What do I do ahead of time to prepare? And that's kind of where we're going with a lot of this. So, what does it look like? And, kind of next week will be, a lot more of kind of the preparation side. But for this week, I really want us to kind of focus on what happens in our life that ends up in sin. What is it? Is there a situation? Is there a, you're in the wrong place at the wrong time kind of thing? Is it, is it people? Every time I get in contact with this person, I just want to choke them out. I just, it's like, oh, this person, just every time I see them, they just drive me nuts. Is it, when I go to the movies, when I go, superhero movies, right? We all saw the Guardians of the Galaxy, so is it, okay, is it something like that? Is that my issue? And so, how do I understand when I'm hitting those things, and how do I know when it crosses the line that way? It's kind of, that's kind of what we're looking at. So when we go in, so kind of before we hit those conflicts, or the conflict of anxiety, that way. Okay, so I know that there's stuff I'm going to be dealing with, that's going to make me anxious. Kind of being aware in that moment of what caused this. Kind of deconstruct it that way. That's kind of how I was thinking about it. If that makes sense.
Well, it does, because you're right. I mean, I think John definitely refers to that, because you have to be aware of your surroundings. I lost it. When he's like talking about, God is light, in him there is no darkness at all. So that's verse 5. So 6, if we claim to have fellowship with him, yet walk in darkness, we lie and do not live in the truth. I think you need to, and then verse 7, but if we walk in the light as he is light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his son, purifies us from all sins. So I take it that he's talking about, be aware of your presence. Are you in the light or are you in the darkness? And when you do that, then like you said, you start preparing yourself in a way of recognizing when you're in the light and when you're not.
Yeah. And kind of the, we're going to kind of take this step by step, right? So this is step 1, is being aware. It's kind of that battlefield awareness, is kind of, or the, intel. Do you know where you're going to get ambushed? But it's that, can you really recognize it? And when you hit that, when you hit those situations this week, because I know what happens every day for me, maybe I'm the only one, but, I'm certainly not.
Do you really think you're the only one?
Well, that's the joke I make, right? But
right.
It's that, okay, can you stop? In that moment, can you stop? Or, even afterwards with that, can you figure out what happened? It's like, okay, at the end of the day, kind of regroup and say, what happened today? I kind of got my butt kicked. Can we kind of go back through and look at what really happened that way? What situation was it that triggered me off? Because, I don't know if it's the same way for you guys, but I kind of think about it as like a really rusty light switch. You get into these situations, right? So that's the light switch is kind of our will or our decisions that way. And so when we get into a situation, it's like our light switch is always, one way. So my brothers, right, we get into arguments, sometimes it's in good fun, but then all of a sudden, everybody's just mad. And everybody's, gonna just be mad. It's kind of your default reaction. Or at work, right? Like I get into a situation and we have a meeting that just got thrown on my calendar and now I'm anxious about it. Well, I'm just going to be anxious about it. It's almost that like I don't even have a thought about this, or I don't even have a conscious reaction. I just react. And so it's kind of like the light switch is kind of rusted in that position, if that makes sense. So part of this is looking at, how do you, instead of just having the switch kind of always be that direction, right? always be pointing the one way. It's okay, let's focus on being aware in those situations so that we have a choice, if that makes sense. So like you've now got a space to think about, how do I want to react to this? Because if John's saying, I write you so you don't have to sin, so you don't sin, how do we get to that point? Because I know a lot of the times it's like, with this and this, you just go. You're just already there. You're just already in that spot. You don't have a kind of a moment to stop and think and say, okay, what do I really want to do in this situation? How do I really want to act? Or with family, right? I say brothers, but, all family stuff. In-laws, outlaws, whoever, or we've got, superheroes or any of our idols, really. It's like, okay, so what do I need to do before I get in those situations? Or, what puts me in those situations that all of a sudden I'm thinking about that and I'm putting that ahead of God? That's kind of what we're looking to do this week, is to really just kind of be aware and figure out, okay, just be aware of it. That's kind of, and the one thing I want to say, because I know like this gets super discouraging for me, like it's why it's taken me this long to kind of get to a point where I could do something like this and figure stuff out. And Mom's helped me a ton through a lot of this, but it's that like, I always find myself, I get into these and it's like, I'm kind of before the situation and then all of a sudden I'm after the situation, I've sinned, and now I'm repenting and confessing my sin. And it's like I'm kind of, for me, it's almost like this is like pre-sin, so we're going along, we're fine, and then it's like there's this giant gap, and now you're confessing. So it's like, it's almost like kind of a, what was I really doing during this? Did I really have any control over it? And the answer is I did, but I don't really feel like I did. I kind of missed that moment that way. So, and it's being aware here. So that, like the verse says, we aren't just dragged away and then we sin and then we're left afterwards, just kind of hanging out to dry.
Well, yeah, there's some things to us it's obvious. It says flee temptation. There's some things we can see, I better...
that's coming
I
down.
better run, but there's other things it's like, you don't have a clue that you're about to do something stupid.
Yeah.
At least,
lots of people, road rage is an issue. They're just, all of a sudden, I was riding with a friend of mine, most mild-mannered guy in the world. All of a sudden, he was cussing and swearing and had his hand up and all kinds of stuff like that. It was like, wow, like it was just, boom. All of a sudden, he was there. It's kind of like, that's that moment. So a lot of it, it's like, okay, so can we recognize kind of when we get into this, and how do we get out? And the thing, the really big thing that I wanted us to hang on to this week is in 1 Corinthians, it's 10:13, with this. And that is, I can almost quote it, but not entirely.
10:13.
10:13. And so he says, no temptation has seized you except what is common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so you can stand under it. So it's this idea, and it's not just, it's not a hopelessness thing where we're always going to be stuck here, we're always going to be sinning, and Jesus covered it, so it's fine. It's like, no, we don't really have to live with this. We've got a way out. We've got our way out. And so for this week, I want everybody to pick maybe one thing, maybe two things if you're feeling crazy, but we're going to keep it manageable, because I want to kind of build with us a set of tools that we can use for the rest of our lives to kind of deal with situations like this. So that we don't, when you hit a new situation, let's say you tackle lying this week or, anxiety, for these couple of weeks. It's not just that, it's anything. It's kind of going to be our structure. So our first thing is going to be awareness. That's kind of our big focus for this week. But not just, awareness, right? Next week we're going to kind of figure out, okay, so how do we react in these situations? Or what tools do we have to kind of get out of this? How do we get out? Really, when we're in it and it's kind of like, okay, we're ditching this plane and I'm gonna put up my parachute and get out of this plane because it's heading somewhere I don't want to be. It's that's kind of what we're gonna work on. But for this week, really, our win, our accomplishment is just gonna be, can I figure out these situations, and can I start to kind of like, okay, this seems like it's heading this way. You kind of get that spidey sense, I guess, where we'll keep on superhero metaphors. But that, I know this is not heading in a good direction. Even if we still, get stuck and we're still end up here, as long as you can kind of go back afterwards and say, okay, that's kind of where I was dragged into this. That's our goal for this week. So, and the other thing really is to, pray about this. Kind of God is always willing to support us in whatever we do that kind of helps us walk closer to Him, but is there something that God really wants you to focus on? Like you said, is there something that God wants us to do that we're not doing? Or, is there something that God's brought this up for a long while and maybe this is the time to kick it? That's kind of what my anxiety is for me. And I've been doing this for, a couple of months, and it's getting there. I'm getting to the point where it's like, okay, I don't have to kind of be there. I can understand the situations where I'm at. I can prepare for those, and I can, have more confidence in God. That okay, it's gonna be fine. I was freaking out this morning. I was like, no, it's all right. God's got this because this is His class. I'm just the one talking and standing here, and but He's gonna make it work. He promised that He was gonna make it work. So we're gonna kind of get into a lot of those things, but stuff's worked for me, so it's kind of our goal.
So the verses, is it just chapter 1 that you wanted to cover this morning? Is that what I'm a little uncertain as to. So if I go back through and I reread our verses to kind of remind myself, where were your verses at? Was it chapter 1 only?
So verses were pretty much just chapter 1.
Okay.
The Corinthians verse, and there's another section in 2 that we didn't quite get to that was kind of helpful. So, it's something, when we look at this is chapter 2, 15 and 17, this way.
Okay.
This is kind of John setting it up again. This is the do not love the world section.
1 John 2.
Yep, 1 John 2. 15 and 17.
So it says, do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of his eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever.
So, and this is our motivation with this. That is our motivation. Look, the world sucks. It's gonna end. It's kind of that, like my super crazy diagram, if anybody remembers this. This is when Christ died. Christ died here, and God's kingdom started. And eventually, this world is going to end. It's going to be no more, I don't know if they'll have superhero stuff in heaven. I kind of hope Star Wars makes it, right? It's good enough. God says, oh yeah, that's great. Let's keep this. Stuff all the things that Disney's doing, we'll just keep the original stuff. But it's all that stuff ends one day, and the only stuff that's left is God and His stuff. We'll have a new heaven, a new earth. Everything's getting purified that way. So Like that's our motivation. That's kind of our motivation verse, and also the 1 Corinthians 10:13. That way too, it's the God's got a plan. You can get out of this. There's a way out. You know, so it's, but part of it, it's like first, before you can figure out how we get out of a situation, you got to figure out the situation. You know, where am I going to get ambushed? Who's gonna ambush me? What situation am I gonna be in? Is it me sitting in my car? Is it me at work? Is it me at home sitting around doing nothing? You know, whatever it is that way. You know, that's what we got to figure out for this week.
I was gonna say, but you know, I like the way that in verses 15 through 17 talks about it, because, you know, he's kind of directing it a little specifically in the ways of, for everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man and the lust of the eyes and boasting of what he has and does comes not from the Father but from the world. And so he's, you know, he's giving you some direction as look in these areas.
Yep.
And when you do that, you know, you can start seeing that light and darkness that he's talking about in the first chapter.
Yeah, you know, he's kind of giving us some more of those specific examples, but you know, at the end of the day, it's like we've all been around, right? I could say that with this class. You know, it's not like we don't know kind of where our sin is, at least the big stuff. You know, it's like it's not writing us anything new. It's just saying, okay, take it. Let's go back to basics. You know, really, it's like, okay, we've got all this cool highfalutin stuff. Let's get back to basics. You know, God said, you know, live with me, and the one who loves me is going to go obey my commands. You know.
Well, and it's not, you know, he's talking, you know, light and darkness, but really, when you step out of the light, it's not just a jump right into the dark black pit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's that gray area. And so that's what he's addressing, you know, to be aware that, there, you know, we're striving for the light, but it's not like you're just gonna go right over to the dark side immediately.
It's not like you step off the curb and all of a sudden.
Grayness that you're gonna have to be aware of and start discerning. What does that look like? How is the world in my response to the world?
Because it's almost always, and something I was realizing, it's almost always a slide. It's like you're doing okay, and then it starts to kind of angle down, and all of a sudden you're just dropped off. You know, it's like all of a sudden you're just there, and you're like, well, how did I get here? You know, it's like driving. You know, what was it? Shoot, it's the main stretch in like Detroit. It's that main drag there. Woodward Avenue. It's like driving Woodward Avenue, and all of a sudden, you know, it's like you're kind of going. The houses are getting a little more dilapidated, and stuff gets a little rougher, and all of a sudden you're in the ghetto, or you're on 8 Mile or something crazy like that. You know, it's kind of that. Like you start off and you're doing okay, and you just start sliding, and this is kind of that slide. You know, it's like, so it's being aware of that, figuring out what takes us there.
You'd have no idea what I'm thinking now.
Of course not.
A couple verses earlier, it talked about, you know, every temptation we face is not, it's common to mankind.
Yep.
I know a person that I would accuse of him saying like, you know, the kinds of temptations I get, nobody else in the world. And I would say, well, that's, what's it called, illusions of grandeur or something, delusions of grandeur. And then it specifically said, you're facing common temptations that everybody in the world.
Everybody in the world faces. Yeah. You know, it's like, I don't deal with everything that you might deal with, but we sure got something in common, or, you know, at least got something in common with, you know, somebody else. So, yeah. And that's, you know, that's that. So, you know, with this, as we kind of wrap up our first week, that's kind of our big test. You know, it's like, this is kind of the rubber meets the road stuff.
I could get, you know, it's hard to choose.
Well, just, you know, that's the thing, you know, pray about something, or what does God bring up, you know? This is not a, fix everything all at once right now, be a perfect Christian
Well,
class,
one thing.
because
Yeah,
good
pick one.
heavens, like I couldn't teach that. You know, I might as well just like walk out now if that's this class, or sit down and, you know, listen to somebody else. But it's like just one thing, you know, what is it that you struggle with most, or that you hate that you do most? You know, Paul talked about it. I do the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things I want to do. So there was something in there he hated that he did. He absolutely hated it, but he recognized it. You know what? God's grace is still covering me, but I really want to fix this. You know, so is there something that way that kind of been weighing on you, or that God's been bringing up that, you know, hey, let's deal with this. Let's kick this. You know, it's kind of our goal. It's kind of set up some of these tools. So with this, you know, and so if you guys want, you don't have to share exactly what you pick next week, but if you want, you know, it can be really helpful for everybody. If you want to just share with me or like Pastor Steve or something to talk with that. Because part of this, I want to get practical. You know, there's a whole lot of stuff in this great book of ours. I mean, it's got to be printed on special paper, so it's not like 1 billion miles thick, right? There's a whole lot of stuff in here that'll kind of talk about these ditch moments, right? How do I get out of this situation? And so with that, if we want to share it, you know, we can do some super practical stuff. If you don't want to share it, I would encourage you to share it with somebody. If it's not, you know, me or the class or, you know, one of the pastors, to get help. Because one of the things, and I'm kind of cheating, but our last week, you know, John really talks about we're doing this together, so help each other. You know, so this is not about you have to fight this alone. You know, part of this, as you get things out into the light, right? Let's say we drag that behavior into the light. Well, all of a sudden you can see it for what it really is. It's not this scary thing that just drags me away and all of a sudden, you know, I have to confess it. I can figure out, okay, what's the pieces to this? You know, Jesus picked apart Satan's lies in the desert. It's like, well, you know, Satan said, oh yeah, you could just, you know, demand that all of these stones and things become bread. And Jesus says, well, that might be true, but the real bread of life is the Word of God, you know? So he kind of brings it back to that. So we're going to look at kind of those practical things. What's going to make a difference in those situations for us? How do we pick apart the situation to beat it? So, and I'll be praying for everybody, you know, as we go through this too, because, you know, heck, can't do nothing without prayer. But any last thoughts or any prayer requests as we end this week? So, anything going on?
Oh, share something I asked for prayer reform. Life's